2025, the year of Gen Z activism. From the Philippines to Morocco, Madagascar, and Mexico.
Young protesters, they start to recognize each other's concerns and each other's language and the worries that they all share.
If young people don't see a secure future, there is going to be much more despair.
Looking at Asia, today's youth movements echo patterns we have seen in recent years, and even further back. What do Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka have in common? Youth-led protest movements in these South Asian countries have toppled governments one after the other. Nepal in 2025, Bangladesh in 2024, and Sri Lanka in 2022.
These were driven to a large part by younger people that were not seeking political change. They were seeking better lives.
Meenakshi Ganguly is the Deputy Director of the Asia Division at Human Rights Watch.
The reason that it turned into a demand for resignations quite often was when the government acted in a way that led to human rights violations. So we are also recognizing that when there are these authoritarian governments, and if the public becomes very, very angry, then it is very hard to control that kind of crowd.
In Nepal, the protests were triggered by a social media ban. In Bangladesh, by government job quotas. And in Sri Lanka, by an economic crisis.
Political leaders need to hold themselves to account for failing their citizenry, for failing the younger population that is looking towards their future and is worried about jobs, about employment, about cost of living, about the climate, about so many different issues that are of pressing interest to younger people.
Thousands of kilometers away in Indonesia, similar scenes unfolded. Weeks before Gen Z protests exploded in Nepal, Indonesians took to the streets in August 2025 to voice their anger at lavish perks for government officials. Unlike Nepal, Indonesia's protests did not force a change in leadership, but President Prabowo Subianto did roll back some government perks.
DPR menyampaikan akan dilakukan pencabutan beberapa kebijakan DPR RI, termasuk besaran tunjangan anggota DPR dan juga moratorium kunjungan kerja ke luar negeri.
Government concessions that we saw in Indonesia, which of course was very symbolic and very minimal.
Dr. Yatun Sastramijaya is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Amsterdam.
Like, okay, let's retract those housing bonuses, let's reshuffle the cabinet and fire the most problematic or the most unpopular MPs, and then the problem is solved.
The August protests didn't come out of nowhere. In February 2025, for example, there was a nationwide movement called Indonesia Gelap, or Dark Indonesia, against austerity measures. And then in March, there were more protests after Indonesia's parliament passed revisions to the country's military law, which allocates more civilian posts for military officers.
So if you look at all these protests together as one bigger wave that is formed by all these smaller waves, you see that the underlying issues are so closely related and none of them are solved actually.
Dr. Sastramijaya told EW that young people will return to the streets as long as the structural issues are not resolved. The latest waves of protest feel familiar. Asia's youth have been here before. In 2014, yellow umbrellas filled the streets of Hong Kong as protesters demanded the right to choose their own leaders. Protests erupted again in 2019, this time against a plan to allow extraditions to mainland China. While the extradition bill was eventually withdrawn, Beijing later imposed a sweeping national security law in response to the protests.
港區國安法係香港走出困局，從亂到治嘅轉機。The national security law is actually not a legal thing, but a political tool for the regime, for the government to suppress political dissidents.
An additional security law called Article 23 further tightened restrictions. Fast forward to December 2025, and Hong Kong's last major opposition party was dissolved.
If you mix pro-democracy agenda with state sovereignty agenda, things get really messy.
Dr. Janjira Sombat-Punsiri is a research fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg and an assistant professor at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok.
The likelihood of a protest movement to succeed will decline because it has to do with security issues.
In Thailand, young people also demanded changes to the country's entrenched power structures. Thai youth even dared to call for reform of the powerful monarchy, an issue that once would have been unthinkable to raise in public.
นี่คือบทบาทของสถาบันกษัตริย์ที่ไม่ได้อยู่เหนือการเมืองถ้าเราเปลี่ยนแปลงตรงนี้ไม่ได้ไม่มีทางเป็นประชาธิปไตยครับพี่น้อง
But that pro-democracy movement has also waned. Human rights lawyer Anon Nampa, the first person to publicly call for reform of the monarchy, is languishing in prison. As of July 2025, his cumulative sentence is more than 29 years.
I wouldn't say that the movement failed completely. Thailand has come quite far from the moment when there was almost no challenge to the old elites.
What about the protests that brought down governments? Are the gains only short-term?
So in terms of structural political changes, we very rarely in history see an immediate result from youth-led movements.
If a movement gains support from the broad-based pillars of society, then the change tends to be more sustainable.
In Sri Lanka, one family, the Rajapaksas, had dominated politics for decades. The Aragalaya movement in 2022 forced them out. 2 years later, Anura Kumara Dissanayake was elected president. He campaigned on promises of tough anti-corruption measures and good governance.
Sri Lanka's entire protest was also because of terrible economic policies that benefited the rich. A new government has now come in, elected on the promise of that kind of social justice, and they are making some steps, but they're of course limited by the fact that there is a financial crisis in the country.
While there is progress in Sri Lanka, experts also say many of the promised democratic reforms remain unfulfilled.
For instance, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, a law that was used repeatedly to detain people without charge for months, years, this law has still not been repealed.
In Bangladesh, Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus was sworn in as interim leader after Sheikh Hasina's 15-year rule came to an abrupt end. But more than a year and a half later, some have criticized the Yunus-led interim government for not doing enough on human rights reforms.
And some of the problems that we had noticed earlier under the authoritarian government of Sheikh Hasina have been replicated, including, for instance, the arbitrary arrests of people that are considered opponents. While her government had targeted her political opponents, the interim government has failed to protect people who are being arbitrarily arrested because they are seen to be suspected loyalists of the now deposed Hasina government.
In February 2026, Bangladesh will choose its new leader, the country's first vote since the student-led uprising that ousted Hasina.
আমরা এমন নির্বাচন চাই যা দেখে অভ্যুত্থানের শহীদদের আত্মা তৃপ্তি পাবে, তাদের আত্মা শান্তি পাবে। আমরা চাই আগামী নির্বাচনে সবচেয়ে বেশি ভোটার, সবচেয়ে বেশি প্রার্থী ও দল অংশ নেক। এটা সবচেয়ে অবাধ, সুষ্ঠু ও নিরপেক্ষ নির্বাচন হিসেবে জাতির কাছে স্মরণীয় হয়ে থাকুক।
Nepal will also head to the polls in March for elections that will test youth-led street energy.
The democratic future of a country obviously does not depend on social movements or youth movements or any kind of movements alone. This has to do with the whole constellation in power and how far they are willing to concede to demands for democratization, coming from the ground.
If a country is an entrenched autocracy, then uprooting that and transform a country to a fully functioning democracy will take decades, if not a generation.
While the triggers for protest movements across Asia differ, the underlying cause is similar: young people demanding political and social change. But such structural reforms take time.